One of the most common questions in Final Fantasy XIV, almost as old as the game itself, is how do I start raiding? If you're also uncertain of how to start, you've come to the right place. This video will go over when, where, and how to start, as well as all of the necessary preparation needed for someone who has never raided before to begin raiding smoothly. The first thing to ask, or I suppose question 0, is why do you want to begin with? Your answer to this might help you to decide in what capacity you raid, and I don't mean this to gatekeep. Let me give some examples. If you're getting into high-end because you're seeking a greater challenge, good call, this will probably be everything you've hoped for and then some. If you're getting into high-end for the sole purpose of getting better equipment from Savage, you should remember that said equipment is only better for about 9 months before it's obsoleted. It's also worth considering that the only thing that requires you having Savage gear is Ultimate, which is even harder. So if you don't like Savage, then Ultimate is automatically off the table. If you later find that you don't enjoy Savage but force yourself into it for the gear rather than the journey, you'll be highly susceptible to burnout. If you initially get into high-end for a specific cosmetic reward, but similarly find that you don't enjoy it, I would recommend waiting until the following expansion, where the duty will be significantly easier to do unsync. That will allow you to get the reward in question relatively stress-free. If you're just doing it because it's the next thing, that's also valid. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't, but the important thing is that you're considering whether or not you find it actually fun. Anything short of an enthusiastic yes is a no, which there's no shame in admitting and stopping. The overarching sentiment here is that, while any reason for starting to raid is valid, the decision to continue raiding should be made entirely out of love for the experience. No reward is worth you suffering to get it. Now that you hopefully have a better idea of if you want to raid and why you do, the first real question is whether you intend to raid with a static, that being a fixed raid group, or by plugging in Party Finder. If you plan to raid in PF, then this very easy first step is already done, but if you want to raid with a static, this will likely be the hardest step of them all. I'll go over some advantages and disadvantages of each to hopefully help with the decision. Firstly, for statics, there are a lot of important considerations that go into choosing one to stay with. They will need to play often enough for your liking, at consistent times that also work for you. You'll also need to be around the same level of skill and intensity as them. An intensity mismatch means fundamental incompatibility, but a skill mismatch might be okay in a more teaching-focused group where that's explicitly okay. Their loot distribution rules, if any, need to be acceptable to you as well. If something feels off, you should probably ask for an explanation as to why it is that way, and leave if you don't agree with the reason. Lastly, you need to actually like the people you'll be raiding with, and they need to like you. Realistically, you can't know this until you've already raided with them, which is why it's standard practice for established statics to offer new members a trial run before they accept the position permanently. The only real disadvantage of a static is finding one that meets all of those criteria being very difficult. Rather than misinform you that the process is easy like others will do, I will openly admit it's really not. Finding a static that's a good fit for you might actually be more difficult than raiding with a static. In fact, the reason this is framed as step 1 is because finding a static, or even just choosing it if you want to, has the potential to take a very long time, but can be done while following the other steps. I'll now suggest a few places you can look. Statics will sometimes list in PF with the slot locked to the role lane need. Generally this will be listed as the fight they are progging, but sometimes it'll be in the other section, which falls to the very bottom. Or maybe a static that's missing a few people will be in PF looking for subs for that day. If their opening is permanent, it wouldn't be a bad idea to fill and then ask for the play. You might also look out with Community Finder or Fellowship Finder, but those are not standard methods of static recruitment. Instead, the generally accepted best method is to join Discord servers dedicated to FF14 recruitment and browse the listings there. The Balanced Discord also has recruitment channels that are equally viable. This list isn't exhaustive, so if you run a static, suggesting the places you recruit for it in the comments could help others as well. Raids in PF, on the other hand, appear to be more flexible. You can raid at any time as long as a group of 8 can be gathered, which can be helpful if your schedule is inconsistent. You also aren't bound to any one group. If you leave, your teammates probably won't hold it against you, and even if they did, you probably won't see them again. The lack of commitment also means that you can play entirely based on your personal needs. Once you have a mechanic down, you can move up your prog point without waiting on the others. And once you have the rewards you want from a given fight, you don't have to do that fight ever again if you don't want to. So going with PF may sound like an easy solution, but it comes with significant drawbacks. The quality of play is wildly inconsistent. You could have a group of crack gamers that clear in 1 or 2 polls one day, and a group of completely incompetent players that have no chance of seeing the prog point the next. More likely, your party will be somewhere in the middle. If you have bad players so bad that your good players can't compensate for them, you have a very low chance of actually clearing with that party. Also, there's a surprisingly large chance, 1 in 5 if you're in the NA region, that any given person joining your party literally cannot read. Roll that again for each person not in the pre-made. As a result, the person joining without reading may not actually meet your listed requirement. Due to both factors in combination, other people leave early, and then people leave because someone else left. It can take a long time to fill up a new group that meets your requirement, and that new group has the potential for the exact same thing to happen again. As a result, even though you can attempt to raid on a whim, how much of that time is spent actually raiding is completely out of your control. Lastly, outside of the JP region, loot is distributed purely randomly based on each player's role for the item, like in low-end content. While this has the potential to be great if you're lucky and win a lot of things very quickly, it can just as easily be awful if you still don't have the drop you need after several months. While finding the right static for you is undeniably difficult, you only need to do that once. If you go with PF, you replace the need to find the right group for you once, with the need to find a kind of okay group every time you want to raid, which will be just as rough every time. While you can keep leaving bad groups and searching for new ones with relative ease, doing so can feel like rolling a pair of 6-sided dice for a 1. As for my personal recommendations here, if you still aren't sure by the end of the guide if raiding is even for you, I would recommend that you try and PF. That way, if you end up not liking the content, you don't have to do it again. You won't feel the same pressure to continue that you would in a static. If doing this, you need to be sure to base your judgment on the content and not the people. If you give up raiding because of a toxic PF group, you might be giving up something you actually would have enjoyed in a static environment. Alternatively, if a free company or another community is hosting a teaching event and you meet their listed requirements, that would be a good first exposure. If your schedule is inconsistent, you probably already came to your own conclusion that PF is your only option, but I'd recommend it anyway. Instead, if that's because of something fixable, I would recommend trying to fix it, as that might be easier than raiding in PF. On the other hand, if you value consistency more than a chance at a better result, I would recommend a static. While having an okay to good static eliminates the chance of matching with a great group, it equally ensures you won't end up with a bad group. If you play low hours but have the ability to schedule within those hours, I'd recommend a static, as it's possible that, during shorter sessions with PF, you spend the entire time waiting for a group to fill and don't actually get to do the content. If you prefer raiding as a social experience, where even if people are making mistakes, it's not a big deal as they still have fun spending time together and helping one another improve, you will only find that level of investment and camaraderie between permanent members of a static. Lastly, if you already know that raiding is for you and you're in it for the long haul, I would actively recommend not using PF. Instead, make your best effort to find a static you like, specifically one that aims to stay together into future tiers or even in future expansions. While the search may be difficult, if you're going to be raiding for a long time, the value proposition of a long-term static becomes impossible to ignore. Now that you hopefully have a better picture, the next question is, when is the best time to start? Am I too late? Should I wait until next year? And to that I say, raiding can be likened to planting a tree. The best time to begin raiding was at the start of the Savage tier, but the second best time is now, on whatever day you're watching this, whether that's week 1 of a tier, a month down the line, or even post-unlock. The belief that the older a piece of content gets, the less interest there is with doing it in a first-timer, can be used to argue that today is a worse time to start than yesterday. But by that same reasoning, tomorrow will always be a worse time to start than today. The best course of action will always be to attempt what is currently available as soon as possible. The next thing to know is which content to start. It's fairly common to not be sure if you're ready for specifically Savage, and between that and the plethora of other options such as Extreme and Unreal, it can be very intimidating to actually decide where to begin. Here's a little information on the difficulty of each format to hopefully help you with the decision. Unreal and Extreme are generally seen as onboarding content for Savage, occupying the middle ground between normal raids and Savage raids. Most recent EX is generally pushed as the starting point by others, but that isn't the whole story. Damage and mitigation checks in EX are usually relaxed, and there are far fewer body checks present. EX also introduces you to things such as fixed positions, recurring mechanics, and the need for pre-planned strategy. All of that will be relevant throughout all of high-end content. However, the mechanics themselves are extremely difficult, to the point that in severe cases an EX can be comparable to the first or second turn of its parallel Savage tier. Older on-level extremes are harder to recommend due to the ease of outgearing. Unreal, however, are the actual best first exposure to high-end content. While they're on paper equal in difficulty to an extreme trial, due to being older encounters with different design sensibilities, they're generally easier than their parallel EX, while retaining the learning experiences. In addition, the item level sync makes them substantially easier to gear for. Savage raids are usually harder than both, with that increase in difficulty stemming from tight damage and mitigation checks, frequent use of body checks, and most mechanics requiring everyone to be resolving them using the same pre-planned strategy. The difficulty is handled within a given tier, and sort of resets between tiers. For example, you didn't need to have done P1S through P8S to attempt P9S, as P9S was also considered a first turn and was substantially easier than P8. The hierarchy isn't quite as easy as that though, it is loose and there are exceptions. In the case of 7.1, to give a specific example, where the choice is between Queen Eternal, which is anomalously hard, or Byakko, which is anomalously easy, I would actually say it's better to go to M1S for your first exposure. As a result, I will be updating a pinned comment with the current patch and best starting point. The formats I've listed so far are the only formats you should start with. I'll go over the rest here for completeness in case you want to pursue them, but you should only do so after you've got some other clears under your belt. Chaotic Alliance raids and base difficulty Criterion dungeons are understood to be equal in difficulty to Savage raids, about a second turn, but they're generally pursued after Savage as the gear from Savage makes them significantly easier. The main gimmick with those is party size. Criterion dungeons are done with a 4-person party, and Chaotic Alliance raids with 24 people. The reason these aren't recommended as first experiences is, in Criterion's case, you can fill a fresh party just fine, but if someone leaves, your only options for replacements are generally only fresh players. The inability to retain progress between sessions isn't recommended for a first exposure. In Chaotic's case, due to the high player count and large arena, not only is any given wipe statistically unlikely to be your fault, but you're also very unlikely to even know what wiped you. The lack of agency isn't recommended for a first exposure. Large-scale raids within field operations, namely Baldessian Arsenal and Delubrum Reginae Savage, are considered high-end, but they are more so their own thing with their own skill set. The maximum instance size is very large and coordination is needed, but most mechanics can be dodged as a party. So this content is usually handled in discords where the raid is centered around single central shot callers. Not to be confused with base difficulty Delubrum Reginae, which isn't low-end content. Deep dungeons are also high-end, but again, completely different thing with an even more different skill set. Ultimate Raid, whose access are locked behind clearing their parallel Savage tier, are generally seen as the pinnacle of difficulty in Final Fantasy XIV. They consist of many short phases containing multiple harsh war mechanics that require pre-planned strategy. There will be less time between mechanics and no checkpoints between phases, and the fights themselves are quite long, meaning that Ultimates test the player's consistency and endurance far more than Savage. Lastly, Savage Criterion dungeons, despite being called Savage, are closer in difficulty to Ultimate Raid. Due to long encounter length of over 20 minutes and revives being disabled entirely, Savage Criterion dungeons are a far bigger check for consistency than any Ultimate Raid. However, unlike Ultimate Raid, players have the opportunity to practice the mechanics themselves in the normal Criterion difficulty, as they are identical to the Savage mechanics. It's not unlike the various sims that exist for Ultimate mechanics. Now that you've decided which format of content you're going to be doing, the next step is to prepare yourself for that content. First, decide on which role and job you want to play. Yes, singular. Due to the weak limitations on the vast majority of gearing sources in Final Fantasy XIV, we'll get to that later. Being severely under-focused in your selection will be detrimental towards all of them, as you'll have to spread the same amount of equipment between multiple roles. Additionally, different jobs approach high-end content in different ways and have different limits that need to be tested to optimize, so switching too rapidly can make it difficult to actually retain that information. A jack of all trades is a master of none, and in the context of raiding is generally worse than a master of one. Having flexes is encouraged, but you should really choose one main job, and the main factor that goes into deciding that should be how much you enjoy playing that job. If that is still multiple jobs, another consideration can be the difficulty of the job. The easier a job is, the less you're focused on the rotation, which frees mental capacity for mechanics. You could also choose based on how popular the job is. The more popular it is, the harder it will be to find a party that does not already have it. If your main is popular and you plan to raid in PF, it's recommended to have a second job in the same role that you can also play well, as it allows you to switch to your secondary to join parties that already have your main. Alternatively, if you intend to raid in static, keeping your options open is advisable. If you have multiple jobs you're willing to raid on, listing all of those jobs can widen the range of statics you're able to join. Then they make the decision for you depending on what their group needs. The job they accept you on is your new main. Once you've got a main job in mind, seek out a guide for playing it in order to refine your rotation and priorities. I'm actually not going to recommend a video guide here, not even one of my own, as this is a live MMO and things can and do change. Instead, I'd recommend the balance guide, text guides, as they're all but guaranteed to have up-to-date information purely by nature of format. Video is hard to update, text guides easy to update. Practice your rotation on a striking dummy, and once you're confident in that, bring it into some low-end duties. Now that you are actually halfway decent at your main job, the next step is to get it raid ready in terms of equipment. I'll go over your options here. Firstly, very little gear preparation is needed for Unreal trials. Due to the tight item level sync, any level cap gear is okay. To know if your gear is good enough to go into non-Unreal high-end content, compare it against the community-imposed entry level, which is what's reasonably easy to get without raiding and isn't time-gated. Even if it's overkill, having it anyway is considerate to the party and shows that you're actually serious about getting into raiding, whereas not having it tells people that you're generally uninvested in the game or that you haven't studied. At the start of a raid tier, during the Even major patch, a new set of crafted gear will be released, which the rest of the guide will use +0 to refer to the item level up. The high-end raid, having every gear slot at +0 or higher is considered the bare minimum, and the easiest way to achieve that is simply by buying or crafting a full set of crafted gear. Remember, high quality only, base quality is briefing. In the middle of the raid tier, during the Odd Major patch, that crafted gear gains the ability to be augmented to +10, so 10 levels higher than what it was before, for a small price of uncapped tombstones, so having a +10 weapon and +10 average item level is considered the new minimum. There are other methods of obtaining gear without raiding, maybe even better gear, but due to time gating they aren't relevant if you're looking to raid with some degree of urgency. I'll go over them anyway for completeness in case you aren't in a hurry or just absolutely cannot afford crafted gear. Even patches also add a new type of capped tombstone. There's a limit to how many you can earn per week, but you can use them to buy +10 gear. When spending these, buy the optimal pieces first, which is easily known by checking the balance's pre-planned best in slot set. Weekly weeklies of the normal raid tier will reward rollable tokens, 1 per fight per week, which could be traded for +0 gear, excluding a weapon. The final normal raid turn also has a sword token as a completion reward independent of the rollable tokens. 7 of those and some capped terms will get you a +10 weapon. The weekly limitation on normal raid tokens is removed, and the tome weapon now only requires 4 sword tokens. The Alliance raid drops rollable +10 left side gear that you can get 1 piece of per week, and a coin as a completion reward that can be used to augment a piece of +10 tome gear to +20. This can't be used on tome weapons until later. Tome augmentation items can also be bought using nuts from Hunt. Again, not weapons until later. Once you're actually doing high-end content, more gearing options open up to you. Extreme Trials drop weapons of varying item levels and can be farmed as much as you'd like. Current Savage tiers, on the other hand, work significantly differently, with strict limitations on loot beyond you may only loot this once per week. Firstly, you must defeat the bosses in order. If you skip earlier bosses by joining a party for a later boss, you forfeit your loot opportunity for those earlier bosses the moment you enter the instance. You won't be able to double back, even if you don't end up clearing the later boss. Also, instead of your loot opportunity being spent when you win something, it is spent when the boss dies, regardless of whether or not you actually win anything. If you repeat the fight in the same week, you won't be able to roll on the loot. Additionally, the amount of loot in the chest is reduced based on how many people in the party have already spent their loot opportunity. If 1 to 4 players have already spent it, the loot in the chest will be halved. If 5 or more have already spent it, no chest will appear at all. The only way to guarantee full loot is if everybody still has their loot opportunity unspent, which is commonly referred to as 2 chests. If you're having bad luck with the chests, or generally wish the process was a little faster, worry not. When you spend your loot opportunity, you also gain a buck for that fight, which can be used to buy the gear it would drop. You will need more than 1 buck to buy 1 piece of gear though. As for what the loot actually is, the first turn drops coffers for +20 accessories, 1 for each slot. The second turn drops coffers for +20 head, hand and foot gear, an augmentation item for tome accessories, and a token that allows the buying of a tome weapon without the normal raid sword tokens. The third turn drops coffers for +20 chest and leg gear, an augmentation item for tome left side gear, and an augmentation item for tome weapons. The fourth and final turn drops 2 +25 weapons, 1 random loose one and 1 copper, a mount, minion and Orchestrion roll. In addition to having good equipment, you will also be expected to have certain other items. Firstly, ensure you have relevant materia in your equipment. Materia increases your substats, mainly those that help you to deal damage. Having basic meld, filling in only the guaranteed slot, is seen as bare minimum as it's relatively cheap. If you could afford crafted gear, you could afford that too, and if you can't, then get the clusters from roulette. Advanced melding, or pentamelding, is a further damage increase, but very expensive and therefore not required. Now for consumables, the first to get is the best available buff food, which is expected to be always active when in high-end content. Not only does it increase your damage by a notable amount, it also provides additional vitality, which can often be the difference between surviving an attack and not, especially during the early weeks. You can know which exact feed to buy by checking the aforementioned balance best in slot set. Alternatively, go to the market board, check all of the foods that are the same item level as current +0 crafted gear, and buy the one with the stats your job wants. The second consumable you'll need to stock up on is the gem draft, formerly tincture. These potions temporarily increase your main stat, which significantly increases your damage during burst windows. These are mainly expected in parties aiming to clear, including reclear and farm parties. While you're still learning the earlier parts of a fight, it's generally seen as a way to use them, but you should still carry them in case the party makes it far enough that there is a chance to clear. Speaking of learning, healers, red mages, and summoners will want to bring MP restoring super ethers to learning parties, especially during the early weeks, as the amount of necessary raising and GCD healing can take a significant toll on mana pools. However, keep in mind that using one of these also puts your gem draft on cooldown and vice versa, so be careful on clear parties. HP restoring items are rarely if ever used in high-end content. Like ethers, they also induce the cooldown of gem draft, but unlike ethers, the cooldown is short enough to possibly not cost you a use. The HP restoration amount is simply too small to matter most of the time. The last few steps will be specific to each encounter and need to be repeated for each encounter. First is looking up a guide for the specific fight you'll be doing, and more goes into it than simply searching for Insert Boss Guide and clicking the first result. If you're in a static, the decision is made for you by the static leader. The guide they send is the one you watch, and the strats they send are the ones you're doing. If you're raiding in PF, a good way of deciding which guide to watch is to skim the PF listings on your region's raiding data center to see which guides are referenced in descriptions the most. At the time of writing this guide, Hector Guides by Hector Hectorson are the most popular. Most of the standard strategies are either exactly what is shown in the guide or very slight variations of it. But even if you're using a different strategy, he still explains it the best from a technical standpoint. Alternatively, if you're doing the fight blind, the expectation will be instead that you have not watched a guide. But it's generally advised against doing blind prog as your first exposure to high end. Strategy differences are typically communicated in the PF description. If a short phrase is used, it is most likely a strategy name, and those named in the description are the ones that party will be doing. If you already have a general understanding of the fight but aren't sure of what a specific phrase in the description means, ask before joining and the leader will probably give you the information you need. Other times there will be a direct link to a raid plan, which will show a slideshow-like visual representation of the mechanics and explanation of how they are done in more detail than a PF description would normally allow. Be careful when opening links from strangers though. Other times it's both, where a shorthand phrase is referring to a particular raid plan. On the topic of PF descriptions, it's also important to read them for prog points. If you see a party that is listed as, for example, Bonds 3 prog, that means that anyone joining is required to be consistent on all of the mechanics before Bonds 3, as the party is aiming to practice Bonds 3. If you're new to a fight, list your group as fresh or join a fresh group. Depending on your region, the way that positions within that strategy are distributed may vary. Usually on JP and OC, sometimes EU, upon entering the DD, a leader will use a macro to quickly send in party chat a description of each mechanic that requires a fixed position, with notation as follows to describe who each player is meant to be. After the macro is sent, each player announces one of the positions, which decides your position for all of the positions for the whole fight, based on that one callout. Usually on NA and sometimes EU, this is done through a marker dance instead. Markers will be placed in a certain formation depending on the mechanics, and players will position themselves relative to the markers in order to claim positions. Often, if multiple mechanics need fixed positions, there will be multiple marker dances. This on paper allows players to have drastically different positions between mechanics, but in practice, it is more often used to catch out the people who get it wrong. This is yet another advantage of a static. You may only have to do assignment and strategy discussion once. When you're re-clearing a fight, you'll almost definitely just be doing it exactly the same as last time. With that, I believe we've covered everything and reached the end of the video. If you found it informative, please give some support. If you have an additional suggestion you think I missed or didn't explain in enough detail, or a personal story on how you started raiding, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Your comment will likely help others, and my feed delivers them to me from all over my channel regardless of how old the video is. Fun fact, only 0.7% of my viewers are actually subscribed, which is about the same chance as a mount dropping from your first extreme clear and you winning it if nobody passes. Thank you for watching.